A very warm welcome to the London School of Economics, to today's online seminar series hosted by the International Inequalities Institute. I'm Shalini Grover. I'm an anthropologist and a research fellow at the III. And I'm incredibly pleased to be chairing today's seminar titled Of Victims, Sisters and Caring, Anti-Trafficking, State and the Sex Workers Movement in Sonagachi, India, which is part of the III's Inequality Seminar Series. Today's speaker and discussant, we're still waiting for our discussant to connect with us, but they're a wonderful combination of an anthropologist and a historian. Simanti Dasgupta, our speaker, is an associate professor of anthropology and serves as the Director of International Studies at the University of Dayton in the US. Her overarching interests lie in the politics of citizenship and belonging in post-colonial and neoliberal nation states. Simanti has published widely. Her first monograph by Philadelphia and Temple University Press, titled Bits of Belonging, Information, Water and Neoliberal Governance in India, was published in 2015. Meanwhile, she's also preparing her second monograph, which is around the subject of HIV/AIDS, anti-trafficking and sex work. Her journal articles have appeared in places such as Polar, Cultural Dynamics, Anti-Trafficking Review. So a very warm welcome to you, Simanti, and we've been waiting to hear your work for a long time. We're equally honored today to have our discussant, Professor Shamit Hassen, who's joined us. She's the Ware-Harmsworth Professor of Imperial and Naval History at the University of Cambridge. Shamita is based at Trinity College and her work needs no introduction at all. She's published very widely on gender and labor and so many other topics and subjects. Indeed, she's one of those rare scholars, in my view, whose research combines the past, the colonial, and the contemporary, the post-colonial, in very nuanced and lucid and interdisciplinary ways. And there are many accolades to Shamita's credit. Her 1999 monograph by Cambridge University Press, Women and Labor in Late Colonial India, won the Trevor Rees Prize in Commonwealth History. So Shamita is also a very well-known voice in the international women's movement and within India. We are truly delighted to have her with us today online. A very warm welcome, Shamita. As this event is on the Zoom and not a webinar format, we can see our audience and have an interactive event. So may I ask the audience to keep themselves muted, but have their videos on wherever possible. This is our final event of the term's Inequality Seminar Series, and you can find our recordings of all our previous events, workshop, etc. On our website. A link can be found in the chat. I'll now hand you over to Simanti. Many, many thanks to all of you who have joined. And do enjoy the event, and I'll connect with you at the start of the Q&A again. Thank you.
Shalini, thank you for the warm welcome, and thanks to the International Inequalities Institute for the invitation, and also to Shamita for kindly being the discussant for today's. So my paper today draws upon my current book manuscript, and I'll actually start by sharing my screen. So the paper actually draws from my current book manuscript. It's called Prophylactic Rights, Sex Work, HIV/AIDS, and Anti-Trafficking in Sonagachi. It is based on ethnographic work with Durbar Mohila Samanway Committee. Henceforth, I'll be referring to as Durbar. Durbar is a grassroots female sex work organization in Sonagachi, the iconic red light district in Kolkata. My larger project examines how Durbar foregrounded the body as a site of labor and how quote-unquote prostitutes came to inhabit the worker position. In the manuscript, I argue that for labor to emerge as a political category, the women submitted to the HIV/AIDS and anti-trafficking surveillance, while also reinscribing them with resistive meanings. For today's talk, I will be focusing on the relationship between anti-trafficking and how may we think about care work in that context. Before I begin, I just wanted to give a brief context about anti-trafficking laws in India. It is an extremely fragmented terrain, and I have listed all the laws that apply in India, but not in a very consistent manner. So the first one, which many of you are familiar with the Indian context, is the Immoral Trafficking Prevention Act, which conflates prostitution with trafficking. Now, this act actually has a history of being in from the 1956 and then going back to the early 20th century. To add to that, we also have a legal situation where the Women and Child Development Ministry constantly proposes bills to either pass a new law or to amend the existing law. And the recent one was from last year, which by far is the most draconian bill ever proposed, because it involves death penalty, it involves the National Investigative Agency. It also applies to traffickers who are quote unquote deemed foreign. So in a way, this is a very fragmented terrain. On top of that, just as a reminder, the Indian Constitution already has Article 23, which prohibits trafficking. And on the ground, it also often happens, and I've witnessed this myself, the IPC or the Indian Penal Code, which again is a colonial heritage, is often evoked to arrest sex workers, their customers, and to also harass them. So the idea of this is to convey to all of you that as much as we want to think about trafficking in the legal context and in the context of care, we are also thinking of an extremely fragmented terrain. And to sum all this up, in India, sex work is not illegal, neither is it illegal. So it kind of occupies this quasi-legal terrain. And because of the quasi-legal terrain, it enables a place like Sonagachi to function. It enables sex work, but at the same time, it also opens up the space for enormous state violence. So this is the context that we have to keep in mind when we are thinking about how may we conceptualize care work. And to think about the global context, we of course have the Palermo Protocol, which was adopted by the UN in the year 2000. And the US, the United States actually had a very significant sway over the drafting of the protocol, because before that, the year before that, the United States had already drafted their anti-trafficking protocol. And what happens now is that the US since 2000 publishes something which is called the Trafficking in Persons Report, where they rank each and every country in the world. Till about 2010, the US did not rank itself, but now they have started ranking themselves. So the ranking basically is like it has 4 tiers. Tier 1 is countries are doing fantastic job with prevention of trafficking. Tier 2 is more or less okay. Now, tier 2 watch list is when a country isn't doing well, and tier 3 is actually doing terribly. But I can talk more about this later, about how data is collected at the national level, and it's quite amazing that there is only one email that you can just send reports to, and what the organizations that are prioritized in this are mostly the abolitionist organizations and not the sex work organizations. So that itself tells you about how this machinery works. And then you also have the Global Slavery Index, which in 2018 named India as the home to the largest modern slaves in the world. And then it also ranked next to North Korea. It was 53rd. So that obviously triggered the Women and Child Development Ministry to issue another bill. But when I have worked with the Women and Child Development Ministry, it was interesting because anytime I said that, it seems like these bills are always being proposed anytime there is a global report of slavery or something. But, they would obviously deny that. They would say, no, this is not a matter of concern. But it's easy to kind of actually unpack all the global layers. So So given this legal context, which obviously not just a national context, there is a local context, there's a national context, and there is a global context. So in terms of this, it's an extremely fragmented and extremely complex apparatus which is in place, and it's constantly shifting. So we have to, once we have that idea, I'm hoping that the presentation of the ethnography will make more sense to all of you, and I'd be happy to obviously answer questions towards the end. Now, in this larger situation, what Durbar does in 1997 is they establish what they call the Self-Regulatory Board. The Self-Regulatory Board is Durbar's commitment to anti-trafficking. And given that truly nobody knows the red light district as good as they do, so they would obviously be the knowledge brokers to kind of prevent trafficking and effectively do so. One of the demands the Durbar always have had from the very beginning is to revise the ITPA, that is the Immoral Trafficking Prevention Act, to substitute, to take sex work out of, actually sex work doesn't even appear in the legal context, but prostitution, to kind of decouple prostitution and sex work and put sex work under the Ministry of Labor. It is a completely grassroots initiative, and it does not have a state mandate. But as we will see in the presentation today, this actually creates a rather interesting relationship between Durbar and the state. And one of the hallmark features of the board, which I hope will become clear today, is that it departs from the otherwise carceral approach of the state. It takes a very human rights approach and a very humanistic approach. And finally, through the working of the board, we can start kind of interrogating the key concepts of anti-trafficking, such as consent. What is consent? What counts as migration? Who is a trafficker? Who is victim? Who is worthy of victims' rights, and what is victimhood? So all of these are the work that I have done over the past, since 2011, to kind of see what anti-trafficking work actually looks on the ground, and a very, very complex picture arises. So this is the chart that the sex workers had drafted themselves as a way to look at the work of the board based upon their experiences. I don't know if you can see it very well, but it starts with identification, meaning a new woman or a new entrant has come to Sonagachi and she is identified, which is actually rather easy. They say notun mukh, a new face. So then once that a woman has been identified, she's brought to the board, and then the review begins, and to determine the status of whether she was trafficked, whether she was a minor, etc. But this is where it gets extremely muddled, because even to determine somebody is a minor, the bone ossification test is the standard test that's done. But the bone ossification test is not very conclusive, because what it does, it gives a range. So it says the age range is, say, between 18 and 21. So that doesn't really say anything, or it'll say 17 to 20, right? So that does not, it's kind of very, very muddled in that sense. And then, of course, the board sessions continue for many days. Sometimes the longest session I've attended with the board was one which continued for 2 weeks. And it's an extremely arduous process. And today I'm going to talk more in details about that. So going into the ethnography, I'm presenting a specific vignette from my fieldwork, but not because it is in any way unique. It actually signals a larger pattern of how the board actually works and how women come to Sonagachi for sex work. What else can I do? Where else can I go? With your help, Didi, I will do this work. Why would I have to endure so much oppression? Here, at least I can make a small living and look after my son. Can you go tell my husband? He's waiting outside. He can go back to the village, but you won't hand him to the police, right? Just let him go. At this point, Joyanti broke down and began weeping inconsolably. Then, barely regaining her voice, pleaded, "Pai kori didi, oke chhere din. I beg you to let him go," meaning the husband. Joyanti's toddler son, who was busy playing with his worn plastic toy, looked up and stared at her. Kalpanadi, one of the members of the board and a sex worker herself, reached out and cupped Joyanti's hands in hers and consoled her. Babu, amra sob buঝি, আমাদেরও এই একই অবস্থা. To translate, darling, we understand your situation and we share your pain. The sex workers had located Joyanti the previous evening, a notun mukh, a new face, that is, a new entrant in Sonagachi. After Joyanti calmed down slightly, Purnimadi, noticing the despair in Joyanti's voice, gently asked her if she was really willing to join, quote unquote, this work. Joyanti responded slowly as she wiped her tears with the end of her dupatta, scarf. This was not her first time in Sonagachi, she said. But this time she came there on her husband's insistence. She had come to work in Sonagachi 4 years ago. At that time, after a board session that had lasted 2 days, including a bone scan, had estimated her age between 18 and 19. The board members at that time were concerned that she was a minor and she was not cleared for work. Joyanti continued, I came to Sonagachi 2 years ago, but by myself. But at that time, the Didis said I was a nabalika or minor. So they sent me back home. But I did this work anyway, in a small town close to my village. Then my family received a marriage proposal for me and I got married. Thinking that my husband will understand and that we are starting a new life, I told him about my past, how I came to Sonagachi and then worked in the town. He assured me that this will always remain a secret between the two of us. Joyanti's voice started quivering again. She paused for a moment to gather herself and then continued. Later, after my son was born, he started beating me and swearing at me. He had no jobs anymore as a farm worker, and there was very little money coming into the household. My husband was very angry at me, and I don't know why, all the time. One night, when he was yelling at me and beating me, I ran to the courtyard, frightened that he will kill me. The neighbors came to my rescue and saved me. But when he came out, this is when Joyanti again broke down in tears. My husband told everybody that she, and pardon my use of this word, that she is a khanki. Khanki is a very derogatory word for prostitute. That she is a khanki from Sonagachi. I was ostracized in the village. Nobody would talk to me. How did I suddenly become a khanki from a ghorer bo, a housewife? I don't know. The word reached my bapir bari, my maiden family. Even they were hesitant to take me back when I wanted to return. My husband decided we will come to Sonagachi since I was a khanki anyway. Otherwise, he will leave me. I had no choice. I came here with him. That is correct. But I did not want to come. I just wanted a samsar, a household. But please don't give him to the police. She implored with Purnimadi again and again. Didi, please don't turn him to the police. He is a poor man. They will kill him. Purnimadi assured Joyanti that if her husband had indeed brought her against her wish, she will talk to him first and not hand him to the police right away. And if Joyanti joined, quote unquote, this work, Durbar will protect her since the sex workers' jibon kahini or life stories converge in Sonagachi. We have all been there in some form, Purnimadi noted poignantly. But Durbar, our Jauna Kormi Shanghaton, our sex work organization, was founded to give new meaning to our lives that is beyond tears and struggles. So you can stop crying, you will be a worker and earn your own and look after your own child. But make sure you don't give your husband your earnings. Most men in Sonagachi are khanewala. Khanewala is a term used in Sonagachi by the women when a man is extractive and exploited. Khane means they just take. So it's like they take away from them. So Purnimadi would always caution all the new entrants about men who are khanewala, meaning extractive. And very few, Purnimadi would assert, are denewala, which means they provide, they're providers. The other sex workers present nodded their heads in agreement, and Kalponadi once more reached out to Joyanti, this time drawing her close in a hug and said, you are like our Chotobon, younger sister. We are all sisters here. And then pointing at me, said, this Didi, she is also our sister. The above vignette is from one of the many sessions of the board I attended during my fieldwork. Jayanti's travels are not exceptional. Rather, her story exemplifies the wider pattern of rural-urban displacement that routinely lead women to join sex work in Shonagachi. In many ways, care work is central to the women's lives in Shonagachi. Today, I want to explore a specific question, that is, how may we conceptualize care work provided by the sex workers in Shonagachi vis-a-vis the juridical benevolence claimed by the state in the realm of anti-trafficking. In doing so, I want to trouble the legal framing of victim, victimhood, consent, trafficker, trafficked, etc. as simply given categories. Drawing upon Folber and Wright, I distinguish care work from other forms of work. Care work is heterogeneous, may be emotionally intense, and are often person-specific. The output of this work may be produced by both paid and/or unpaid workers, and recipients often lack the competence, information, or time to make good choices. Other scholars have also explicitly described it as effective labor associated with those who cannot care for themselves and as labor that requires the expenditure of time and energy. Care work is expected to be intrinsically rewarding and has deep social traction as a natural and normative quote-unquote feminine trait. Deemed as, therefore, women's work, it is not fully compensated for time and energy expended. In other words, it is challenging, if not impossible, to fold what Shamit Hassen and Nilanjana Sengupta has termed the transactional surplus into a definite exchange value. Then all of this together produces and often justifies what we have come to call the care penalty. I want to introduce 5 lines of inquiry here. Let's begin by noting that in the conversation above, sex work as a specific kind of corporeal labor is mainly mentioned as quote unquote this work, or in Bengali, ei kaj. So it's a lot of euphemism. Now, such euphemisms are actually not rare in Shonagachi. For instance, sexual intercourse is usually referred as customer boshano, or accepting a customer. Now, there is also an entire world of slangs for which I had received a collective tutoring one day. Notwithstanding the intimate nature of the work, which understandably evokes euphemisms, but euphemisms themselves are critical ethnographic data because they reveal the social legal framework under which sex work happens. It's stigmatized, feminized, and criminalized. Therefore, my first point is that the care work of the board needs to be located within this marginalizing social legal context, and how sisterhood becomes a key to anti-trafficking work on the ground. I also want to note that my use of sisterhood is not uncritical, and this is also relevant for my book manuscript. In a hyper-competitive sex market such as Shonagachi, where sex workers self-categorize themselves into A, B, and C categories based on a scale of declining income, and I can talk more about this categorization later, and ongoing disputes over babus or lovers, or divulging a sex worker's HIV positive status, etc., makes sisterhood, quote unquote sisterhood, like any other form of kinship, inherently complex. Likewise, my use of sex work is also not a monolithic category. Second, this care work is invisible. By invisible, I also want to underscore the materiality of what is unseen, even unseeable. The work of the board happens in the deep recesses of Shonagachi, which is a labyrinth of intersecting alleys, often illegible to a first-time visitor like I was in 2011 when I started this research. Predictably, red light districts like Shonagachi are typically denoted as Nishiddho Polli, or forbidden neighborhoods, or Kharap Jaiga, bad places, irreputable places, which is inimical to the norms of Bhadralok, norms of respectability, the norms of respectability by the Bengali educated middle class. Apart from the police, some state officials, Bhadralok state officials, also expressed their hesitation to me about visiting Shonagachi. One officer one day at the West Bengal AIDS Prevention Control Society put it that he has never visited Shonagachi, even if his work is located in Shonagachi. Going there is a risk, you know, he told me. What if someone from my neighborhood spots me there? He won't know I'm there for work, so I just send my subordinates. They are young and not married. But I have a wife and a family, and I have a respect to maintain. Third, when we look at the board processes, the care work, which sometimes lasted for days, if not weeks, is not really accounted for, even in the chart that the women themselves drew up. While some women, the sex workers, told me that they had not anticipated how much emotional labor, how much time they would have to contribute. Others, however, considered this work as a supportive environment, which was time-consuming, but was critical for Durbar's anti-trafficking stance. Still, a few others saw this as quote-unquote women's work. As one woman put it, only we as women can understand the dukkha koshto, or the pain of another woman. Either way, this kind of paid work increasingly begins to resemble unpaid work, care work, to the extent that it involves effective and emotional labor. Fourth, the literature on care work has adhered to the classic distinction that underscores the industrial capitalist system, that is between the production in the market, the public domain, and social reproduction in the household, the private domain. Sex work, however, poses an interesting issue here. While commercial sex is a public market production, the intimate nature of reproduction, though, occurs in private. In introducing what they term the pragmatic intimacy, Shen and Sengupta have made a similar argument about domestic work to map the hierarchical relationship paradox between the mistress and the maid. This is partially relevant for sex worker-customer relationship, but resonates rather closely with the sex work Malkin relationship. Malkin is the brothel owner. Sex work, however, also departs from domestic work in a kind of spatial reversal, I'd say. The brothel, the home of the sex worker, is also the space and a place of work which customers visit. Finally, the care work of the board must be located within the larger context of anti-trafficking apparatus, legal apparatus that I had begun with. And the frantic avoidance and the distrust of the state, especially of the police, by victims like Jayanti. My views of victim here is not self-evidentary. Rather, I interrogate the conventions that underscore the social legal constructions of victim and who is a worthy victim that is worthy of rescue and human rights. Was Jayanti trafficked? Now, if we look at the key piece of legislation, ITPA, which also then overlaps with the Palermo Protocol, the questions of consent and mobility, if we just take these two issues, we see that while Jayanti had agreed to her husband's plan to move to Sonagachi, can we really argue that she consented? Now, if we look at the etymology of the word consent, there is a way that you feel your answer. There's a way that you feel, and we definitely see that Jayanti felt otherwise. She thought of herself as a ghorer, as a housewife, who was coerced into prostitution because of the past stigma that glued to her. I just want to take a minute to talk about the metaphor of the glue here. This is a very common metaphor in Sonagachi and among sex workers, that they always signify the strength, the power of the stigma of sex work as glue, as atta, that sticks to their bodies. That's something that you just simply cannot get rid of. So when I'm using the word glue, this is something, it's kind of an ethnographic data to kind of think of how sex workers themselves perceive that stigma to the metaphor of the glue. Yet, as in most sessions I attended, neither the board nor Jayanti used trafficker or pacharkari to depict the husband. These words were never ever used at the board. And this was a very, very interesting, because when I started attending the board session, I expected that these words to be used. Maybe not trafficker, because that's an English word, maybe not, but pacharkari, I expected that word to be used. It was never ever used. And that is a very interesting point here. The evasion of pacharkari especially is quite intriguing. Now, the sex workers in Sonagachi routinely make another distinction between trafficker and pacharkari. One would think that these are actually translations, right? Pacharkari is trafficker, but in the ethnography, it actually was not translating, because the sex workers said, no, pacharkari is not the trafficker. They actually make a very, very interesting distinction. Now, to them, trafficker refers to a stranger with ill motives. Pacharkari, on the other hand, is someone they had trusted. A lover, a husband, a father, a neighbor, others. Although it is well documented that in reality, the trafficker is seldom a stranger, the emergence of the trusted lover, for example, to become the pacharkari, offers the necessary emotional space to discern the betrayal and to navigate that kind of betrayal. Based on their own shared experiences of betrayals and abandonment, the sex workers on the board were acutely aware that if they categorized the trusted person as the pacharkari, for instance, if they started calling Joyanti's husband pacharkari or trafficker, that would re-victimize Joyanti. So these words were very carefully avoided. When Joyanti expressed particular concern that her answers may incriminate her husband and the dread of police brutality, this message flowed seamlessly across to a group of sex workers who have historically been subjected to this kind of state violence themselves. Historically, anti-trafficking apparatus emerged as a response to a moral panic largely related to white slavery, and a racialized call to care. The notion of victim, however, racially expanded over time. It has been beneficial to some extent, no doubt, in preventing trafficking, but in conflating sex work with trafficking, it has also been rather detrimental to the labor and livelihood of sex workers. If by being designated a victim, one expects care, then how does Joyanti, like others I met, who are deeply wary about the state and the police, navigate this terrain? Or is it possible that the state's juridical approach, after all, tantamount to the violence of care, as Samina Mullah has written about? Now, above all, the carceral approach and the securitization of the state, as elsewhere, leaves very little room for care. And that is attentive to the structural inequalities that routinely render women, children, and men vulnerable to trafficking, let alone the emotional turmoil any victim experiences. The bureaucratic framework demands an exact determination of what is consent, who is to be categorized as a minor, trafficker, victim, etc., which in turn becomes an extremely oppressive exercise. Still, officers at the Lal Bajar police headquarters or the police precinct in the neighborhood of Sonagachi assured me that they do care about the women who have been rescued through counseling services and what they said is compassion or dorud. I never quite witnessed such compassion. Instead, what was conspicuous was an ingrained suspicion of the victim's narrative that she was inevitably lying. The following excerpt, and I have shared this on the slide here. The following excerpt is from one of the Child Welfare Committee officers. And just to give you a context for the Child Welfare Committee, when a minor is identified, the state requires that the minor be handed over to the Child Welfare Committee or the CWC. So part of my ethnographic work often took me to the CWC office because, inevitably, if there was a raid and women were taken away who were deemed quote unquote minors, so that was the first place Durbar would go to figure out where these women are now. I mean, nothing much came out of it, but it was an important ethnographic site for me to kind of thinking about how the state's idea of care pervades anti-trafficking. So this is an excerpt from one of the officers who had this to say. So he's talking about a specific case when we were there to talk about, a woman that was apprehended the day before who was not a minor, but he completely ignores that case and he starts talking about somebody else. So the other day I was talking to this girl who was rescued from Sonagachi, he says. She said she was from Joyshri Nagar near Bonga. Now I am from Bonga. I wanted to see if she was really from Konka. So I asked her to identify some local landmarks like a Chowmatha, like a crossroad, or a local market, a local bazaar. She couldn't. Then she changed her version completely and said she had gone out to buy some eggs and then by mistake crossed the border. How is it possible that you crossed the border and then ended up in Sonagachi? She must have crossed the border with a trafficker to go to Sonagachi. But Bangladeshis are not allowed to work here without a work permit. The border is an important zone and we need to keep it under check so that no trafficking is occurring there. The CWC officer had totally ignored Purnimadi's inquiry about a specific woman whom she was referring to and decided to mention a completely different woman or case, as they usually refer to it. And also based on a presumed Bhadralok fellowship with me, it seemed he only spoke to me as though I were the only interlocutor in the room. In navigating the state, it was also remarkable how anti-trafficking and border securitization were automatically fused. Both the Child Welfare Committee and the police routinely construed these cases as illegal border crossings by Bangladeshi women. There is undoubtedly embedded in a larger mode of border thinking, where anti-immigration often masquerades as anti-trafficking, turning trafficking into an issue of national security. The triad, which is morality, mobility, and border keeping, underscore anti-trafficking governance, leaving very little room for a humanistic or a human rights-based approach. I also want to think beyond the triad, to argue that this is another instance where the state outsources sex workers for care work, like they routinely do in HIV/AIDS prevention programs as well, where sex workers are recruited as peer educators. Not surprisingly, there is a considerable number of Bangladeshi sex workers in Sonagachi who closely guard their nationality. In my years of work, I had never seen an Indian sex worker ever attempting to divulge the nationality of a Bangladeshi either. Besides, sometimes even when the board suspected that a newcomer may have been from Bangladesh, say as a Muslim, she did not wear the traditional Hindu signs of marriage, like a vermilion shell and black bangles, or spoke a different dialect of Bangla. Nonetheless, the embodied symbols, nor the dialects or their lack thereof, did not directly determine the outcome of the session. Lastly, it is rather common for new entrants or quote-unquote victims to change their stories, which often prolongs a board session indefinitely. Rather than interpreting the narrative shifts as indicator of endemic immorality, that is lying, the sex workers even were frustrated, but demonstrated compassion as sisters. In other words, to narrate one's life story as a linear, unbroken sequence is a matter of privilege. The sex workers' lives, after all, are all about, quote unquote, the struggling along. Jointy's later bone scan showed that she was between 22 and 24 years old, hence not a minor. After 2 days of deliberating with Purnimadi and others, she decided to join sex work and was inducted as a member of Dubar. Jointy found a room in a brothel and would begin as an adhiya. Adhiya is
sorry, Simanti. How long more? Because Shamita has got to. Okay. Thanks.
So she decided to join sex work and was inducted as a member of Dubar. Jointy found a room in a brothel and would begin as adhiya, where half of her earnings would go to the malkin or the brothel owner. I met Jointy during my rounds with the peer educators. Contrary to Purnimadi's advice, of course, the husband reclaimed his patriarchal status and seemed like he was in control of Jointy's earnings. This surely irked Purnimadi. Now, Jointy, and one day I ran into Jointy again, and she said, "My son is happy here, Didi. I can finally feed him some fish." She said this with an unmistakable beam in her eyes. In this paper, I extended the concept of care work to foreground a space such as the red light district, which is feminized, stigmatized, and criminalized, while also squarely located in the market. In the recesses of such quote-unquote forbidden zone, we saw the unfolding of empathy that is based on a humanistic approach to anti-trafficking. Thank you for your time.
That was totally fascinating, and I'm so sorry that I had to interrupt you, but time is running. So there's nobody better than Shamita to unpack this really complex and beautifully theorized piece. Thank you, Sivanti.
Thank you, Shimanti. It was really a remarkable presentation. I was, it'll take me a little while to absorb all the ramifications of what you're saying. So I'll keep my discussion to a short and to a couple of issues that emerge from particularly the Jayanti story that you told us in some detail. Just to start, though, the Global Slavery Index is a bit of I also take a lot of interest in that. And it's remarkable how even within a very short time, their definitions of slavery have changed. So after that identification of India as having the highest number of slaves, they've changed the definition, and now India is not any longer number one. It's I think number 8 or something. But it's what it should, that is not the whether India is number one or not is not the moot point. What is interesting is how much all this depends on definitions, and how slippery is many of these definitions, especially when it comes to slavery. To move to Jayanti's story from there, I am very curious about a couple of things about the self-regulatory board. First is so we have, I haven't done any work either on Durbar or Shonagachi, but I've worked with Durbar. And one of the issues that is often raised in relation to Durbar and the working of the self-regulatory board is its constitution. So because you said that sex work is not a monolithic term, in fact, there are huge power relations within it. And one power relation came up repeatedly in your talk, which is minors. But there is also, when you say Adhya and the brothel owner taking half, there is obviously people who are, there is a wage relationship within sex work. So how do we treat this wage relationship? And how incidentally then, where does the husband come in that wage relation? So if the woman is earning half and the brothel owner is taking half, then the husband is actually taking again from that half, which is another private employment relationship within the public employment relationship, which is in action. So the woman sex worker then is embedded within multiple employment relationships. And just to contextualize that historically, I have found this even in the 19th century. It was not uncommon for husbands to exercise the right to prostitute their wives. So it is legitimate for husbands to lay claim to a share of the earning of the wife from prostitution, from sex work. And this is a very old thing. But what makes Jayanti's case interesting is that the husband is resorting to this when, as you said, his own earnings decline or are interrupted. So it follows the pattern which Ananya Roy calls patriarchal failure, that when there is when the family's income is, when the man's income is disrupted in any way, the woman will have to earn in any manner possible and that is legitimate. That is an extension of her familial role, that she will have to do whatever work she can get in order for the family's maintenance. So she's not only is she embedded in a patriarchal relationship within sex work, she is also in that sense in a double kind of patriarchal relationship, because she's also in the, so it is when we think of sex work as liberating from the family kind of patriarchy, in a sense, Jayanti's example is very emblematic of how that is not the case. How you can be actually do sex work and still be in the familial kind of patriarchy. So I wonder if you would say a few words about that, because a lot of the Durbar's discourse has this sort of underpinning of kind of liberatory notion. So the third set of questions, it is very often the case, and I did a small study once on trafficking, women who had been rescued from trafficking. And we were looking at South 24 Parganas, but women who had been trafficked and rescued and brought back were from all over the country. So that some had gone to Bihar, a lot of them had been to Maharashtra, Pune and Bombay were common, and so on and so forth. And they had been, through raid and rescue, brought back to their homes, and then they had to be rehabilitated. So a variety of NGOs were active in this process of rehabilitation. Now, what we found almost invariably is that women's own, as well as the NGOs' notion of rehabilitation is marriage. Only marriage provides the kind of rehabilitation. It is not livelihood. So the way a lot of international agencies think of rehabilitation in terms of finding skill training, finding a livelihood, it's almost invariably not the woman's own notion of rehabilitation. But many cases that we found were not unlike Jayanti's. I can't remember exactly the husband himself forcing women back into trafficking, but through a variety of circumstances, women get re-trafficked, or they themselves return to sex work because the marriage doesn't work out, etc. Or again, patriarchal failure because there is not enough resources in the family. So this rehabilitation by marriage and re-trafficking is, something that rehabilitation programs never confront very seriously. So I was wondering if you had anything to say about that. My last thing is, again, returning once more to the employment relationship. So I'm thinking of, I've already spoken of two employment relationships. There is the wage relationship within sex work, the relationship of the husband in case of Jayanti, but there is also a third relationship, and that is the customer, the person who's paying the wage. So how do you, why I'm asking the questions about the employment relationship is, of course, because of the dominant trope here, which is reclaiming the status of worker. So in order to understand then how the sex worker is a worker, we have to understand the employment relationship. Or we don't have to understand, but it is, I guess, one of the way forward is to understand the employment relationship. And it is in this context that, in Kolkata, even now, Durbar has been around for more than 20 years now. Its first, I forget exactly, do you remember when the first convention was? 1996, perhaps.
Yeah. You mean that year the manifesto was drawn? Yeah.
Yes. But in this entire time, there has been no acceptance of Durbar's claim to the the worker status from the labor movement in the state. Whereas the women's movement, there is quite a lot of acceptance. Even, in ILO and various other quarters, there is qualified acceptance. But the labor movement, trade unions, labor NGOs still don't accept this. So what do you see as the way forward? Yeah, I'm finishing in a second.
Okay.
So what would you suggest in this context is the way forward? That's it.
Thank you so much, Shamita. That was amazing. Can we please now open this to the audience? You can use the hand raise function, and if by chance I have missed that, you can literally introduce yourself and ask the question. So please go ahead with the questions. Ahana, very warm welcome. Do go ahead.
Good evening. In my time zone, I am from Kolkata. I'm from Calcutta University, studying third year, Sri Shikshadan College, completing my 6th semester. So I have a question regarding the Bhadralok status quo, like in the history, because I am pursuing my history honors. In this history honors, I have studied that the gender analysis, or when the understanding of the gender during the time of the main notion, or having some kind of the Bhadralok strategy, they are having several kinds of women. They can live with several kinds of women, but legally they are having one wife. Like legally they are having one wife, but nobody would say anything on that issue, that they are living, they are like kind of cheating on their wife, or like they are having one wife, but they're still living with the several kinds of women. But still the society doesn't even blame that kind of person. But eventually at the same time, if women did the same thing, then women have been blamed as a prostitute, or women have been like neglected as a derogatory term, just like in Bengali, just like khanki or magi. This is just like you are like degrading the woman, or you are like not showing equality towards the women. And still now it is continuing, not just like the Bhadralok strategy, but to what extent it has been considered as a Bhadralok to that person who are not showing equality.
Shimanti, would you like to answer that?
Yes, of course. Yeah. Ahana, thank you so much. Yeah, actually, that's actually a very interesting thing, right? I mean, the Bhadralok norms of respectability actually has this double gendered standard of when a man does something, then when a woman doesn't. It is so easy to be, like one of the worst derogatory thing you can call a woman in Bengali is khanki, and that's of course there. And there is an acute awareness among the sex workers themselves about the Bhadralok politics, that they understand that this is. So yes, you're absolutely right about that. But at the same time, there is also an aspirational quality to that, because that one would want to be part of that society at some point. But I mean, that's a very difficult path for them to follow. But there is a very strong awareness that, yeah, there is, a lot of their customers are from the Bhadralok community anyway. So like But at the same time, what is also interesting, and I've written about this elsewhere, is also like, the kinship formations outside the Bhadralok society is also, it's not necessarily heteronormative, because I have met sex workers, their lovers and the lover's wife, like they kind of form a quasi family unit. Then how does that kind of contradict the Bhadralok norm of respectability as well? So it is much more complex than that. So my use of Bhadralok respectability is not obviously uncritical. I mean, kind of interrogating what actually that means vis-a-vis sex. So, but Durbar, in going back to Shamit, I just wanted to touch upon another point. Yes, Durbar has not been accepted in anywhere by the labor movement, but I think in some ways it has brought out some questions about sexuality and gender relationship to the forefront within the Bengali community that I think were not there in a way. And I can see this, in changes in ways, the movements in women's rights movements now have taken a different kind of shift, that moving away from the victim ideology and kind of asserting more agency in that. So kind of going back to that, I think it has made a bit of a difference there.
Thanks so much. There's a question here by Tanvira. Is that right? Am I saying your name correctly?
Yeah, I'm
Hey, welcome. Yeah.
So I'm in Glasgow. I just started my PhD in University of Glasgow, and I'm originally from Bangladesh. So I would like to know a little bit about, I heard of like there are a lot of migrants from Bangladesh who are like Hijra identified persons who are moving to Kolkata and like work for some years in Sonagachi, and then they again come back. And this happens like, these are like undocumented without passport and all that. So I would like to know a little bit from your ethnography that like, have you encountered any cases like that? And also like how kinship works when they are changing their localities and going to a new space and then again coming back from there. So how kinship works in those spaces and areas like that. I would like to get a little bit of information regarding that if you have. Thank you.
And thank you. Yeah, so there are several Bangladeshi women there. So they are undocumented. Most of them are undocumented, but there is also like a tradition of silence around that. So nobody really talks about, like, I've never seen anybody talking about a Bangladeshi woman as a Bangladeshi woman, like, because, the languages are the same. So that really doesn't make a difference. But in terms of border crossing, I haven't met any Bangladeshi woman who has gone back to Bangladesh, because border crossing is a very, very difficult issue between India and Bangladesh, especially for a young woman. So they usually come to Sonagachi, and they are in Sonagachi. Most of the other women, they go back home, which they say, they use badi. They say badi jachi, which means going back to their villages. I have not heard any of the Bangladeshi women ever say that. So, and I've been, doing this work for quite some time. Now that you say that, it actually strikes me. I don't remember anybody from Bangladesh saying that. They don't. One of the things that I have, I did not exactly focus on this aspect of the research, which will be very interesting in itself, but do you remember an instance where a Bangladeshi minor was identified by the board? But sending the minor back to Bangladesh was a very, very difficult task because the protocol was that you have to obviously it has to go through the respective states. Then the Bangladesh government will have to notify the family, but all of these has to happen through the border security force on the India part and the border security force on the Bangladesh part. So I do remember like Purnimati, who was my main collaborator in the field, and she was at that time the secretary of the board. Purnimati was very, very anxious to send this young woman back. And she then decided that she's going to actually accompany the young woman to the border. And to hand over to the border security force, she thought that that would be that's a dangerous idea, because one doesn't know if she will ever actually cross the border. And she was also worried about violence from the border security force. So that I remember was a very, very arduous. So, I mean, this young girl did go back finally, but the board members actually accompanied her to the border to make sure that the border security forces give her to the Bangladesh side and the family receives. So it was quite arduous. But now that you say, I haven't really heard the Bangladeshi women go back to their homes. Like they never, I mean, not that they don't, but in my ethnographic data, that's kind of strikes me now. Yeah.
Shamanti, there's another question from Shanti, who's in Malaysia. So that's going to be the last question. And there are questions coming on the chat about how people can read your work. I'll reply to that. You just, Shanti, go ahead. Very welcome. Very warm welcome.
Thank you, Shalini. Very interesting and very valuable piece of work. I don't understand the context very well, but in terms of dealing with your conceptual and theoretical framing for this research, there is an effort to show the violence of public patriarchy, which is the state and the police, but the private patriarchy, which is the husband or the father, and the violence in that. You had a narrative about the poor man. Don't do anything to the poor man, about the husband. Even if she's subjected to violence, you know, she still considers him the poor man. So the kind of care responsibility of the private domain can be extremely violent in terms of a man who's inflicted violence on her, who has brought her to the brothel and who will make an earning from her labor, cannot be excused. And that can perpetuate the cycle of violence. This man can go and have another lover and bring her back, and another wife and bring her back. So it's a very complex situation in terms of how we want to manage trafficking. I think we have to be very careful in terms of how we must not be sympathetic or apologetic to the poor man, in open and close inverted comma. He is making an earning from a violent act of actually appropriating kinship and his familial ties for her to actually now provide for him. And she becomes the provider. And that role of a provider is associated with care. It's a double whammy everywhere, from the public patriarchy, from the state and the police, and the private patriarchy. So I think in terms of, if you're coming from an activist lens, then how do we deal with this? It's very difficult. We cannot say that, and because of the relationship the woman has with, somehow again kinship is appropriated. She's sisterhood. That appropriation of kinship terminologies for her to actually provide for the person who's employing her. They are not doing her a service. She is doing them a service. So I think it's very, very, how to say, an area of huge concern for us. Of course, for those who are involved in activism, to address trafficking.
Sorry, Shanti, we need to end, but I totally agree. This whole trajectory of from the housewife to the prostitute and then coming back to the housewife, I think Shanti's really put that fantastically. So I think you've got lots to sort of answer and think about in your own time, Shimanti. I'm really sorry that we have such little time, but this has been such a wonderful afternoon. I have to thank you and Shamita. I have to thank all of you from other parts of the world, Malaysia, Glasgow, Kolkata. And if you want to know more about our upcoming events, they're all in the chat. You can sign up to our newsletter. That's also, the link is in the chat. But until we meet again, virtually or otherwise, thank you. Take care of yourself and goodbye.
Thank you all.